Some men are broken by loneliness, while others are forged by it. For 10 years, Silas Boone has lived alone in the mountains, convinced he's too dangerous for any woman to love. The townspeople called him a beast after a bloody feud drove him away. He swore off people, especially women, and made the wilderness his only companion. But one spring morning, he comes down for supplies and finds a wedding auction at the church. Women are being matched with men they barely know. Silas means to walk past until he sees Clara Wynn at the altar, forced to marry the banker twice her age to pay her father's debts. Something wakes up inside him, something that's been sleeping for a decade. Before anyone can stop him, he walks into that chapel and announces, "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years." The room goes silent. Then he kisses Clara like his life depends on it and tells the preacher, "Marry us now." But can a mountain man who's forgotten how to be gentle win the heart of a woman who's forgotten how to trust? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Elkhorn Ridge like memories that refused to fade. Silas Boone stood at the edge of his cabin's porch, watching the sun break through the pine canopy in golden shafts that painted the forest floor in amber light. His hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee bitter, black and strong enough to wake the dead. It was the same ritual he'd followed every morning for 10 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Not that he was counting. The weathered hunting knife at his belt caught the morning light, its worn leather handle polished, smooth by decades of use. His father had given it to him on his 16th birthday, and his grandfather had carried it through the war. Now it was just another tool for survival, like the axe that split his firewood and the rifle that kept the wolves at bay. But sometimes, when the wind was still and the forest quiet, he could almost hear his father's voice, telling him that a man's blade was an extension of his soul. Silas ran a hand through his thick beard, feeling the coarse hair that had grown wild and untamed over the years. He was a big man, 6 feet 4 inches of solid muscle and weathered bone, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown elk down the mountain. His hands were scarred from years of working with wood and metal, building and repairing everything he needed to survive alone. The townspeople had called him a giant even before the exile, but now he felt more like a ghost haunting these mountains. The feud that had driven him here seemed like a lifetime ago, though the memories still burned as sharp as winter wind. It had started over land, as these things always did. The Kellerman family had wanted to expand their ranch, and they'd set their sights on the valley where Silas's family had lived for 3 generations. When his father refused to sell, the Kellermans had turned to other methods: burned barns, poisoned cattle, and finally, on a cold October night, they'd come for his father with torches and rope. Silas had been 28 then, newly married to a sweet girl named Mary, who made the best apple pie in 3 counties. He'd tried to do things the right way, going to the sheriff, presenting evidence, believing that justice would prevail. But the Kellermans had money and influence, and the sheriff had been bought long before Silas ever walked into his office. So when they came for his father the second time, Silas had been ready. He'd met them at the property line with his grandfather's rifle and his father's knife, and he'd told them in no uncertain terms that they could turn around and go home, or they could stay and be buried on Boone land. The Kellermans had chosen poorly. 3 men died that night, including old Jeremiah Kellerman himself. Silas had stood over their bodies as the dawn broke, blood on his hands and smoke rising from his burned-out barn. The sheriff had arrived with half the town behind him, and Silas had seen the fear in their eyes, not the healthy respect he'd once commanded, but the kind of terror reserved for wild animals and madmen. "You've gone too far this time, Boone," the sheriff had said, his hand resting on his gun. "Killing in cold blood that makes you no better than them." "They came to my land," Silas had replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "They threatened my family. A man has a right to defend what's his." But the town had already made up its mind. Mary had left him that same week, unable to look at the blood under his fingernails or the hollow look in his eyes. She'd packed her things while he was burying the dead and had taken the stage east without even leaving a note. The message was clear enough. The man she'd married was gone, replaced by something darker and more dangerous. The rest of the town had followed suit. No one would sell him supplies, no one would hire him for work, and the children crossed the street when they saw him coming. Within a month, Silas Boone had become a ghost story, a cautionary tale about what happened when good men went bad. So he'd packed what little remained of his life into a wagon and headed up into the mountains, following old hunting trails and deer paths, until he'd found this place, a natural bowl carved out of the mountainside, protected on three sides by sheer rock faces and approachable only through a narrow pass that he could defend with a single rifle. Here, he'd built his cabin with his own hands, cutting the logs and fitting them together with the same care his grandfather had used to build the family homestead. The cabin was solid and warm, with thick walls and a stone fireplace that threw heat into every corner. He'd built it to last, with windows facing south to catch the winter sun and a porch that wrapped around two sides for the summer evenings when the air was too thick to stay inside. It wasn't fancy, but it was home, the first real home he'd had since Mary left. The years had passed in a rhythm of seasons and survival. Spring meant checking the roof for winter damage and planting the small garden that supplemented his hunting. Summer was for collecting firewood and preserving meat, long days of hard work that left him too tired to think about the life he'd left behind. Fall brought the harvest and the final preparations for winter's siege, while winter itself was a test of endurance and patience. Long months when the snow piled higher than his windows and the world shrank down to the size of his cabin. He'd learned to live with the silence. At first, it had nearly driven him mad, the absence of human voices, of laughter and conversation, and the small sounds that people make when they share a space. He'd taken to talking to himself, then to the animals that visited his clearing, and finally to the mountain itself, carrying on long conversations with the wind and the trees as if they might answer back. But slowly, the silence had become a comfort. It meant safety, solitude, and the freedom to be exactly who he was, without apology or explanation. The mountain didn't judge him for the blood on his hands or the choices he'd made. It simply accepted him as part of its landscape, another creature trying to survive in the wilderness. He'd almost convinced himself that this was enough, that a man could live on solitude and self-sufficiency, that he'd found peace in his exile. But then the supplies had run low, and coffee had become more precious than gold, and he'd known that he'd have to make the journey down to town whether he wanted to or not. 20 miles below, in the valley where Copper Creek ran swift and clear, the town of Cedar Falls was waking up to what would become the most talked-about morning in its history. Clara Wynn stood in front of the cracked mirror in her boarding house room, staring at her reflection with eyes that held more resignation than fear. The wedding dress was white satin, yellowed with age and smelling faintly of lavender and mothballs. It had belonged to Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, who had loaned it out of what she claimed was Christian charity, but what Clara recognized as the peculiar cruelty of women who had never known real hardship. The dress hung loose in some places and tight in others, a constant reminder that this marriage was not her choice and never would be. She touched the silver locket at her throat, her father's final gift to her before the fever took him. Inside was a tiny photograph of her mother, dead these past 15 years, and a lock of hair from her baby brother, who'd lived only 3 days. It was all she had left of the family she'd loved, and soon even that might be taken from her. Her father, God rest his soul, had been a good man and a terrible businessman. He'd trusted the wrong people, invested in the wrong ventures, and had died owing more money than he could have earned in 10 lifetimes. The debt had passed to Clara, as debts always did, and with it had come Banker Fitzgerald's increasingly urgent demands for payment. "You're a pretty girl," he'd told her just last week, his pale eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. Too pretty to be worrying about money matters. There are other ways to settle accounts. The proposal, if it could be called that, had come with the morning's mail. a formal letter written in the banker's careful script, offering to forgive the debt in exchange for her hand in marriage. He was 53 years old, twice widowed, and had a reputation for business practices that bordered on criminal. But he was also the most powerful man in Cedar Falls, and when Harold Fitzgerald wanted something, he generally got it. The wedding auction had been his idea, a public spectacle designed to make Clara's humiliation complete. Under the guise of Christian charity, he'd announced that he was organizing a social event to help the unmarried women of the community find suitable husbands. The reality was crueler. It was a way to display his power and make sure everyone in town understood exactly who owned whom. Clara had tried to find another way. She'd spoken to every businessman in town, pleading for work or a loan, but Harold Fitzgerald's influence extended to every corner of Cedar Falls. No one would hire the daughter of a debtor, not when it might anger the man who held their own mortgages and business loans. So here she stood, preparing to walk down the aisle in a borrowed dress to marry a man she despised, all to pay for her father's mistakes. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her father had always said that a woman should choose her own path in life, that she was too smart and too strong to let any man make her decisions for her. Yet here she was, about to become property in everything but name. Outside her window, the church bell was ringing, calling the faithful to witness what Banker Fitzgerald called a celebration, but what Clara knew was really a funeral, the death of her hopes, her dreams, and any chance she might have had at happiness. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer to whatever God might be listening. Not for rescue she'd given up on that weeks ago, but for strength. Strength to endure what was coming, to survive whatever came after, and to remember who she was, even when everyone else forgot. The knock on her door came too soon, and Mrs. Henderson's voice called through the thin wood. "Time to go, dear. Don't want to keep the banker waiting." Clara took one last look in the mirror, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door to face her future. She had no way of knowing that 20 miles away, a mountain man was strapping on his grandfather's knife and preparing to come down from his exile for the first time in a decade. Some mornings change everything, though we rarely see them coming until it's too late to turn back. The chapel of Cedar Falls had never held so many people on a weekday morning. Every pew was packed with townspeople who had come to witness what Banker Fitzgerald called a matrimonial social, but what everyone else knew was really a spectacle designed to showcase his power over the community's most vulnerable members. Silas pushed through the crowd at the back of the church, his massive frame drawing startled glances and whispered conversations. He'd meant to conduct his business, quickly trade his pelts for coffee and ammunition, then disappear back into the mountains before anyone had time to remember why they were afraid of him. But the crowd had drawn his curiosity, and now he found himself trapped in the middle of something that made his stomach turn. 3 women stood at the front of the church, each dressed in white and looking like they were facing execution rather than marriage. The youngest couldn't have been more than 16, with tears streaming down her face as she clutched her mother's hand. The second was a widow with hollow eyes and calloused hands that spoke of desperate poverty. And then there was Clara. Even from the back of the church, Silas could see the defiance in her posture, shoulders straight, chin raised, eyes fixed on some point beyond the crowd, as if she could will herself to be anywhere else. Her dark hair was pinned up in an elaborate style that didn't suit her, and the wedding dress hung on her slight frame like a costume she'd been forced to wear. But it was her hands that caught his attention. They were trembling so slightly that only someone who knew about fear would notice. Banker Fitzgerald stood at the altar like a spider in the center of his web, a thin man with pale skin and calculating eyes that seemed to catalogue the worth of everything they touched. He wore his finest suit and a smile that never reached his eyes, playing his role as benefactor to the community while orchestrating what was essentially a public humiliation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Fitzgerald announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "we are gathered here today in the spirit of Christian charity to help these dear ladies find suitable husbands among our community's finest men. The crowd murmured approvingly, though Silas noticed how many of the women looked uncomfortable and how the men seemed more interested in the spectacle than the charity. This wasn't about helping anyone. It was about power, control, and making sure everyone in Cedar Falls understood exactly who made the rules. "Our first young lady is Miss Sarah Morrison," Fitzgerald continued, gesturing to the youngest girl. 16 years old, an excellent cook, and skilled in all the domestic arts. Her family's circumstances require that she find a husband who can provide appropriate support. The bidding that followed was brief and brutal. Sarah Morrison was matched with a rancher twice her age, who looked at her like she was livestock he was purchasing for his homestead. The girl's tears came harder now, but no one seemed to notice or care. The widow went next, her match with a shopkeeper who needed someone to tend his children and keep his house. At least there was kindness in his eyes, though desperation had driven them both to this public marketplace. Then it was Clara's turn. "Miss Clara Wynn," Fitzgerald announced with particular satisfaction, daughter of the late Thomas Wynn, educated in the finest schools back east and accomplished in literature, music, and the social graces. A rare flower, indeed, looking for a husband who can appreciate her many qualities. Silas felt something twist in his chest as he watched Clara's face during Fitzgerald's introduction. She kept her expression carefully neutral, but he could see the cost of that composure in the rigid line of her neck and the way she held her breath between the banker's words. "Now who among our fine gentlemen would like to offer Miss Wynn the security and protection of marriage?" The silence that followed was telling. Everyone in the church knew that Clara Wynn came with debts that could bankrupt a smaller man, and the only person wealthy enough to take on that burden was the banker himself. This whole charade had been designed to make his eventual claim look like generosity, rather than what it really was, collection on a debt. "Come now," Fitzgerald said after letting the silence stretch long enough to make his point. "Surely someone recognizes what a bargain is being offered here. Miss Wynn is a beautiful, accomplished young woman who would grace any man's home." Still no one spoke. Clara's composure finally cracked, just slightly, and Silas saw her close her eyes, for just a moment, a gesture so small and so private that it felt like witnessing something sacred. That was when he moved. The crowd parted in front of him like water before a ship's bow, people stepping aside without even realizing they were doing it. His boots echoed on the wooden floor of the church, each step carrying him closer to something he didn't fully understand, but couldn't resist. "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent church. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Fitzgerald's smile faltered, then vanished entirely as he recognized the mountain man who had once killed 3 Kellermans in a single night. Clara's eyes snapped open, and for the first time since entering the church, she looked directly at someone in the crowd. Silas reached the altar in 6 long strides, his presence filling the space like a force of nature. Up close, Clara was even more striking, fine-boned and delicate, with intelligent green eyes that held depths he could spend years exploring. But it was the combination of fear and courage in her expression that made his decision for him. "Marry us," he said to the preacher, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Now." Before Clara could speak, before the crowd could react, before his own common sense could intervene, Silas cupped her face in his large, calloused hands and kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tentative, it was the kiss of a man who had been starved for human contact for a decade, who had forgotten what it felt like to touch another person with tenderness instead of violence. Clara stiffened in surprise, her hands coming up to push against his chest. But something in the kiss, desperation perhaps, or loneliness, or simply the shocking contrast between his rough appearance and the careful way he held her, made her pause. For just a moment, she kissed him back, her lips soft and warm against his. The crowd erupted. Women gasped, men shouted, and Banker Fitzgerald's face turned purple with rage. "You can't just, this is irregular, she's already promised." "To who?" Silas turned to face the banker, keeping one protective arm around Clara's waist. "I didn't hear any promises made. I heard a woman offered in marriage, and I'm accepting." "She owes money," Fitzgerald sputtered. "Her father's debts." "How much?" The simple question cut through the banker's protests like a blade. Fitzgerald's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to name a figure that made half the crowd gasp. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with gold coins payment, for 10 years' worth of pelts and furs that he'd been saving for a purpose he'd never been able to name. Until now. "Will this cover it?" He poured the contents onto the altar, gold catching the morning light, streaming through the church windows. The silence that followed was complete. Even the children stopped fidgeting, sensing that something momentous was happening in their small church. Clara stared at the gold, then up at the stranger who had just bought her freedom with his life savings. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Silas Boone," he replied, "and if you'll have me, I'd like to be your husband." The preacher, a nervous man named Father Mackenzie, who had never encountered anything like this situation in his seminary training, looked from Silas to Clara to the furious banker and back again. "Do you, Miss Wynn, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Clara looked into Silas's eyes, grey as winter storm clouds, but warm with something she couldn't quite identify. Behind her, she could feel Banker Fitzgerald's rage like heat from a forge, and she knew that if she refused this offer, her fate would be sealed forever. "I do," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "And do you, Mr. Boone, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Silas said without hesitation. Father Mackenzie's hands shook as he produced the marriage certificate, his pen scratching across the paper in the silence of the packed church. When it was done, when both their names were signed in black ink that seemed to bind them together more surely than chains, he looked up with something like relief. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The marriage certificate lay on the altar between them, still wet with ink, a legal document that had just changed both their lives forever. Clara stared at it as if it might disappear, this piece of paper that represented her freedom from Banker Fitzgerald and her binding to a man she'd met 5 minutes earlier. Silas folded the certificate carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket, then offered Clara his arm. "Shall we go, Mrs. Boone?" The name hit her like a physical blow, Mrs. Boone. She was married to a stranger, a mountain man who had just spent his life savings to buy her freedom from another man's debt. The magnitude of what had just happened began to settle over her like a heavy blanket. But as they walked down the aisle together, past the stunned faces of her neighbors and the apoplectic rage of Harold Fitzgerald, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. It might be foolish, it might be dangerous, but for the first time since her father's death, her future was not entirely written by someone else's hand. The marriage certificate rustled in Silas's pocket as they stepped out into the spring morning, a legal bond between two strangers who had just bet their lives on a moment's impulse and a kiss that tasted like freedom. The journey up the mountain passed in a silence, broken only by the clip-clop of Silas's horse and the creaking of the wagon wheels over rough stone. Clara sat beside her new husband on the wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, acutely aware of every bump and jolt that brought her further from everything she'd ever known. Her city shoes, delicate leather things with tiny buttons and narrow heels, were already proving inadequate for this new life. They'd been designed for drawing rooms and church floors, not for the rocky mountain paths where a single misstep could mean a twisted ankle or worse. Already she could feel them pinching her feet, and they hadn't even reached his cabin yet. Silas seemed to sense her discomfort without looking at her directly. "It's not much further," he said, his deep voice carrying easily over the sound of the wagon. "Another hour, maybe less." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. The reality of what she'd done, what they'd both done, was beginning to settle in her mind, like sediment in still water. She was married to a man she'd never spoken to before today, heading to a place she'd never seen, to begin a life she couldn't even imagine. The mountain air was thin and cold, carrying scents she didn't recognize: sap, wild flowers, and something else that might have been snow even though it was late spring. The forest pressed in around them on both sides of the narrow trail. Ancient trees that had stood here since before her grandfather was born, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the sky. "You're not what I expected," Clara said finally, the words escaping before she could stop them. Silas glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone more." She gestured vaguely, searching for the right words. "More brutal, I suppose. The stories people tell about you in town are probably true," he finished quietly. "I've done things, Mrs. Boone. Killed men who needed killing, but killed them all the same. If that frightens you, I understand." The formal way he called her Mrs. Boone sent a strange shiver through her. She was used to being Miss Wynn, the banker's debtor, the daughter of a failed businessman. Boone felt like putting on someone else's clothes. It might fit, but it would take time to feel natural. "Are you going to hurt me?" she asked, the question coming out smaller than she intended. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop so abruptly that Clara had to grab the bench to keep from sliding forward. He turned to face her fully, his grey eyes serious and intent. "Never," he said, and something in his tone made her believe him completely. "I may be a lot of things, Clara Killer, an exile, a man who's forgotten how to live around people, but I'm not the kind of man who hurts women. My mother raised me better than that, and my father would roll over in his grave if I ever laid a hand on you in anger." The use of her first name instead of the formal Mrs. Boone made something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "Then why?" she asked. "Why did you marry me? You don't know anything about me." Silas was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the forest as if it might provide answers. "I saw you standing there," he said finally, "and you looked the way I felt, trapped, alone, with no good choices left. I've been alone for 10 years, Clara. I'd forgotten what it felt like to want to protect something besides myself." He clicked to the horse, and they resumed their journey, but something had shifted between them. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was the quiet of two people beginning to take each other's measure. The cabin, when it finally came into view, was nothing like what Clara had imagined. She'd pictured something rough and primitive, logs chinked with mud, and a dirt floor that would turn to mud when it rained. Instead, she found herself looking at a solid, well-built structure that spoke of care and craftsmanship. The logs were fitted together with precision, their surfaces smooth and weathered to a silver grey that blended naturally with the surrounding forest. The roof was made of split shingles that overlapped like scales, and the windows actual glass windows, not just openings covered with hide, caught the afternoon light and threw it back in golden rectangles. A wide porch wrapped around two sides of the cabin, with chairs positioned to catch both the morning and evening sun. Clara could imagine sitting there with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. The thought surprised her with its appeal. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. Silas looked pleased by her reaction, though he tried to hide it. "Built it myself," he said with quiet pride. "Took most of the first 2 years, but I wanted it done right. A man needs a home that'll last." He helped her down from the wagon, his large hands careful and gentle as they spanned her waist. For a moment they stood close together, and Clara caught the scent that she was beginning to associate with hymnwood smoke, pine soap, and something essentially masculine that made her pulse quicken despite herself. Inside, the cabin was even more impressive. The main room was spacious and warm, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that looked like it could heat the entire space, even in the depths of winter. The floors were wide plank boards, sanded smooth and polished to a honey-colored shine. Handmade furniture, a table, chairs, a bookshelf filled with worn volumes spoke of long winter evenings spent crafting useful beauty from raw materials. "The bedroom's through there," Silas said, gesturing toward a door on the far side of the room. "I'll sleep out here on the couch until you're comfortable with other arrangements." Clara felt her cheeks warm at the implication. She was a married woman now, legally bound to this man in ways that included obligations she'd never experienced. The thought terrified and intrigued her in equal measure. "That's very considerate," she managed, then looked down at her impractical shoes. "I'm afraid I'm not very well prepared for mountain life. These shoes, for instance." "We'll figure it out," Silas said. "I've got some things that might work for now, and when I go down for supplies next time, I'll get you whatever you need." The kindness in his voice was almost harder to bear than anger would have been. Clara had spent months preparing herself to endure cruelty, but gentleness from a stranger who owed her nothing left her feeling off balance and vulnerable. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked. Silas was quiet for a moment, feeding kindling to the fire he'd started in the fireplace. "Maybe because nobody's been kind to me in a long time," he said finally. "Maybe because I remember what it feels like to be afraid and alone, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone." That night, Clara lay in Silas's bed, their bed now, though he was keeping his promise to sleep on the couch, and stared at the ceiling beams he'd cut and fitted with his own hands. The mattress was surprisingly comfortable, stuffed with what felt like feathers and topped with quilts that smelled of lavender and cedar. Through the door, she could hear him moving around the main room, banking the fire and settling in for the night. The sounds were domestic and comforting, the noises of someone making a home secure for the night. It occurred to her that this was the first time in months that she'd gone to sleep without worrying about what tomorrow might bring. Her city shoes sat beside the bed, already looking foreign and impractical in this mountain setting. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring challenges she couldn't even imagine. She would have to learn to cook on a wood stove, to tend a fire, to live without the conveniences she'd taken for granted all her life. But tonight, for the first time since her father's death, Clara Wynn Boone fell asleep feeling safe. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called to its matea, sound that spoke of partnerships that endured through the longest nights. In the main room, Silas lay on the couch he'd built with his own hands, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. He'd lived alone for so long that the simple sound of another person breathing in the next room felt both foreign and infinitely precious. He thought about Clara's courage in the church, the way she'd looked Banker Fitzgerald in the eye, even when she was terrified. He thought about her reaction to his cabin, the genuine appreciation in her voice when she called it beautiful. Most of all, he thought about the trust she'd shown by coming with him, by sleeping under his roof, by believing his promise that he would never hurt her. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. He would have to teach her to survive in this place, and she would have to learn to trust him with more than just her safety. But tonight, for the first time in 10 years, Silas Boone wasn't completely alone, and that felt like a kind of miracle all by itself. Clara woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood, each strike echoing off the mountainside in a steady rhythm that spoke of long practice and efficient strength. Pale morning light filtered through the cabin windows, and she could smell wood smoke and something that might have been coffee brewing. She dressed quickly in the same clothes she'd worn yesterday, the only clothes she had, and ventured into the main room. Through the window, she could see Silas splitting logs with methodical precision, his shirt already damp with sweat despite the cool morning air. Each swing of the axe sent wood chips flying, and the pile of split logs beside him grew steadily larger. The coffee was indeed brewing in a pot suspended over the fire, filling the cabin with a rich aroma that reminded Clara she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Her stomach growled loudly enough that she pressed a hand to it in embarrassment, though there was no one around to hear. "Good morning," Silas said, appearing in the doorway with an armload of freshly split wood. "I hope I didn't wake you with the chopping." "Good morning," Clara replied, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. She'd slept in her hairpins, and she could feel loose strands escaping around her face. "The coffee smells wonderful." "It's strong," he warned, setting down the wood and moving to pour her a cup. "I've gotten used to making it thick enough to float a horseshoe. Might want to add some water to thin it down." Clara accepted the tin cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. The coffee was indeed strong, bitter and dark as creek water, but it was hot and caffeinated, and after the events of yesterday, she needed both. "I should probably learn to make coffee," she said, taking another sip and trying not to wince at the strength. And breakfast. And, well, everything really. I'm afraid my education didn't include much practical housekeeping. Silas studied her over his own cup, his grey eyes thoughtful. What did it include? Literature, mostly. Music, I play piano, though I doubt that will be much use up here. French, which is even less useful. Watercolor painting, embroidery, the kinds of accomplishments that were supposed to help me make a good marriage. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I suppose they did, in a way, just not the kind of marriage anyone expected. Can you read? Silas asked. Of course I can read. I told you, I studied literature. I mean, can you read recipes, instructions, books that might teach you practical things? Clara felt a flush of embarrassment. Yes, I can read anything. I just never had cause to read anything useful. Silas nodded and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it, he pulled out a thick, worn book bound in cracked leather. This was my mother's, he said, handing it to her. She wrote in it for 30 years recipes, remedies, household advice, anything she learned that might be worth passing on. Clara opened the book carefully, mindful of its age. The pages were filled with neat handwriting in faded brown ink measurements for bread, instructions for preserving meat, remedies for everything from headaches to broken bones. In the margins, someone had added notes and corrections, the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had clearly known how to make a home in difficult circumstances. It's beautiful, Clara said, running her fingers over a page titled, Sourdough Starter Never Let It Die. She must have been a remarkable woman. She was, Silas said quietly. Came out here with my father when this was still Indian territory, raised 4 children, and buried 2 of them before they were grown. Never complained, never quit, never let the hardships break her. There was something in his voice when he spoke of his Madeira gentleness that was at odds with his fearsome reputation. Clara looked up from the book to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. What happened to her? She asked. Fever took her when I was 25, same winter that killed half the livestock and froze the wells solid. My father said she just decided she was tired of fighting and let herself slip away. He paused, then added, I think she would have liked you. The simple statement hit Clara harder than any grand declaration might have. This man barely knew her, yet he thought his beloved mother would have approved of her. It was a gift she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she deserved. I'll try to be worthy of her book, Clara said, closing it carefully and holding it against her chest like a promise. The rest of the morning passed in a series of small lessons. Silas showed her how to bank the fire so it wouldn't die during the day, how to adjust the damper on the stove to control the heat, how to tell when the coffee was ready by the sound it made bubbling in the pot. Clara proved to be an eager, if inexperienced, student. She burned the first batch of biscuits she attempted, made the coffee so weak it was barely colored water, and managed to fill the cabin with smoke when she adjusted the damper the wrong way. But she listened carefully to Silas's gentle corrections and tried again, and by afternoon she had managed to produce something that resembled an edible meal. Not bad for a first try, Silas said, gamely eating the slightly charred biscuit she'd set before him. My first attempt at cooking lasted 3 days and nearly killed me with food poisoning. Clara laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd had in months. You're being kind. These biscuits could be used to patch holes in the roof. Maybe the next batch, Silas agreed solemnly, which made her laugh again. As the day wore on, Clara found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't expected. There was something soothing about the rhythm of domestic tasks, the simple satisfaction of learning to do things with her hands. More than that, there was something healing about Silas's patient teaching and gentle humor. He never made her feel stupid for not knowing things that came naturally to him. When she struggled with the temperamental wood stove, he showed her the trick of listening to the sound the fire made. When she couldn't get the water to heat evenly, he explained how to position the pot for the best results, always patient, always kind, never condescending. It was late afternoon when Clara made a discovery that changed something fundamental between them. She was exploring the cabin while Silas was outside, tending to his horse, familiarizing herself with her new home, when she opened a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. Inside, carefully folded and smelling of cedar and lavender, was the most beautiful quilt she had ever seen. It was made in a pattern of interlocking rings, worked in shades of blue and gold that seemed to capture and hold the light. Every stitch was perfect, every seam precise, the work of someone who had poured love and skill into every inch. "That was my mother's wedding quilt," Silas said from the doorway, and Clara realized she'd been so absorbed in the quilt's beauty that she hadn't heard him come in. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, starting to fold it back up. "I shouldn't have." "It's all right," he said, moving to sit on the edge of the bed beside her. "She always said it was meant to be used, not hidden away. She made it the year before she married my father, spent all winter working on it by candlelight." Clara ran her fingers over the intricate stitching, imagining the young woman who had created this masterpiece in anticipation of her wedding night. "The workmanship is incredible. She must have been very skilled." "She was," Silas agreed. "She used to say that a quilt was like a mariager, lot of individual pieces that don't amount to much on their own, but when you put them together with patience and care, they become something beautiful and strong enough to last a lifetime." The metaphor hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Clara looked up to find Silas watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might reach for her, might close the distance between them and turn their marriage of convenience into something more real. Instead, he stood and moved toward the door. "I should check on the horse," he said. "Dinner in an hour?" "Yes," Clara managed, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I'll try not to burn anything this time." After he left, Clara sat alone with the quilt spread across her lap, thinking about marriages and patience and the way beautiful things could grow from individual pieces that seemed unrelated. She thought about the gentle way Silas had spoken of his mother, the care he'd taken in building this cabin, the trust he'd shown in sharing his mother's book and her quilt. Most of all, she thought about the moment when she'd looked up and seen something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken, something that suggested their arrangement might become more than just a practical partnership if they were both brave enough to let it. Outside, Silas groomed his horse with more attention than the animal strictly needed, trying to make sense of what had just happened in the cabin. Clara had looked so right sitting on his bed with his mother's quilt in her hands, like she belonged there in a way that went beyond legal documents and convenient arrangements. He'd wanted to kiss her again, properly this time, without the desperation and shock of their first meeting. He'd wanted to tell her that she was beautiful and brave, and that he was grateful for her presence in ways he didn't have words for. But it was too soon, too much, too likely to frighten her away. She'd trusted him enough to come to his mountain, to sleep under his roof, to try to build something from the wreckage of their separate lives. The least he could do was give her time to decide if she wanted more than just safety and shelter from their unlikely union. Time, he told himself, running the brush over his horse's flank in long, steady strokes. They had all the time in the world to see what might grow between them, like seeds planted in good soil and left to find their own way toward the light. 3 days into their marriage, the first wanted poster arrived. Clara was hanging laundry on the line Silas had strung between 2 pines when she saw him coming up the trail with his face set in grim lines. In his hand was a piece of paper that fluttered in the mountain breeze like a trapped bird. "What is it?" she asked, though something in his expression already told her she didn't want to know. Silas handed her the poster without a word. Her own face stared back at her from the crude sketch knot, a good likeness, but recognizable enough. Below the drawing, in bold black letters, were the words, "Missing, Clara Wynn, last seen in the company of dangerous fugitive Silas Boone. Reward offered for information leading to her safe return." "Fugitive?" Clara said, looking up at him. "Is that what you are?" "Apparently," Silas replied with bitter humor. "Fitzgerald's been busy. He's got the territorial marshal involved now, and half the men in 3 counties looking for us." Clara studied the poster more carefully, noting the fine print at the bottom. "He's offering $500, she said. "That's more money than most people around here see in a year." "I know." Silas took the poster back and crumpled it in his large fist. "We need to talk about what this means, Clara, for both of us." They sat on the porch steps, the morning sun warm on their faces, while Silas explained what the wanted poster represented. Banker Fitzgerald had connections throughout the territory, and he wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully. He'd convinced the authorities that Clara had been kidnapped, taken against her will by a known killer who might do anything to avoid capture. "But we're legally married," Clara protested. "The marriage certificate won't matter if they decide. I coerced you," Silas said. "Fitzgerald's probably got witnesses lined up to swear I threatened you, forced you to go through with the ceremony, and my reputation, well, it's not going to help our case." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if they find us, they'll arrest me for kidnapping, and probably a lot worse. And you," he paused, his jaw tightening. "You'll be taken back to face whatever punishment Fitzgerald has in mind for embarrassing him in front of the whole town." The full implications of their situation began to sink in. They weren't just a newly married couple learning to live together. They were fugitives, hunted by men with guns and badges, and the absolute certainty that they were on the right side of the law. "How long do we have?" Clara asked. "Hard to say. This mountain's not easy to find if you don't know the way, and there are only a few trails that lead up here. But if they bring enough men and enough supplies," he shrugged. "Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how badly Fitzgerald wants you back." Clara thought about the banker's pale eyes and cold smile, the way he'd looked at her like property he intended to claim. "He wants me back very badly," she said quietly. That afternoon, Silas began Clara's education in a different kind of survival. He taught her to load and fire his spare rifle, showing her how to sight down the barrel and squeeze the trigger without jerking the gun off target. "I can't," Clara said after her first shot went wide of the mark by several feet. "I've never hurt anyone in my life." "You're not planning to hurt anyone," Silas said patiently. "You're planning to protect yourself if someone tries to hurt you first. There's a difference." He set up a target against a fallen Loga tin can that glinted in the afternoon sun and positioned Clara behind it. His hands covered hers on the rifle, steadying her aim and helping her understand the weapon's weight and balance. "Feel how it wants to kick against your shoulder," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "Don't fight it. Just be ready for it. And remember, breathe out, then squeeze. Don't hold your breath or you'll shake." Clara tried again, focusing on his instructions rather than her fear of the weapon. This time the shot went closer to the target, though it still missed by several inches. The third shot clipped the edge of the can, sending it spinning off the log. "Better," Silas said with approval. "You've got steady hands. Just need practice." They spent an hour at target practice, Clara's accuracy improving with each shot. By the end of the session, she was hitting the can more often than not, though she still flinched at the rifle's sharp report. "Why are you doing this?" she asked as they walked back to the cabin, the rifle comfortable now in her hands. "Teaching me to shoot, to defend myself. If they find us, wouldn't it be easier for you to run alone?" Silas stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Is that what you think? That I'd abandon you the first time things got difficult?" "I don't know what to think," Clara admitted. 3 days ago we were strangers. You don't owe me anything." "I owe you everything," Silas interrupted, his voice fierce with conviction. "You trusted me when you had no reason to. You came to my mountain, slept under my roof, tried to make a life with a man everyone else fears. You think I'd repay that trust by running away when you need me most?" Clara stared at him, seeing something in his eyes that made her heart race. This wasn't about legal obligations or convenient arrangements anymore. Somewhere in the past 3 days, their marriage of necessity had begun to transform into something deeper and more real. "What are you saying?" she asked softly. "I'm saying that you're my wife, Clara Boone, not just on paper, but in every way that matters. And I protect what's mine." The possessive edge in his voice should have frightened her, but instead it sent a warm shiver through her chest. She'd spent months feeling helpless, at the mercy of forces beyond her control. But standing here with a rifle in her hands and a man beside her who would fight the world to keep her safe, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death: power. That evening, they sat by the fire planning their defense. Silas had sketched a rough map of the approaches to his cabin, marking the narrow trails and the places where a few well-positioned shots could hold off a much larger force. "The advantage is ours, as long as we stay up here," he explained, pointing to the various defensive positions. "They'll have to come single file through the pass, and we can see them coming from half a mile away. But if they manage to surround us, if they get close enough to the cabin, we'll deal with that if it happens," Clara said, surprised by her own calm. "How many men do you think Fitzgerald will send?" "Depends on how much he's willing to spend. Professional bounty hunters don't come cheap, but if he wants to be sure of success—" Silas shrugged. "Could be anywhere from 3 men to 30. Clara studied the map, trying to think strategically rather than emotionally. "What about supplies? If we're going to be under siege, we'll need food, water, ammunition." "Food and ammunition we have plenty of," Silas said. "Water might be a problem if they cut off access to the spring, but there's a cistern under the cabin that should last us a week or 2 if we're careful." They talked late into the night, planning contingencies and discussing possibilities neither of them wanted to consider. But through it all, Clara was aware of the change that had occurred between them. They were no longer polite strangers sharing a cabin. They were partners, allies, a team united against a common threat. When they finally went to bed, Silas paused at the threshold of the main room. "Clara," he said, not looking at her directly, "if something happens to me, if they get past the defenses, there's a cache hidden under the floorboards behind the stove. Gold, ammunition, enough supplies to get you to Canada if you have to run." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Clara said firmly. "But if it does, then we'll face it together," she interrupted. "I'm not running, Silas. This is my home now too, and I'm not letting Harold Fitzgerald or anyone else take it away from us." Silas turned to look at her then, and Clara saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Gratitude, yes, but more than that, something that looked very much like love. "Good night, Mrs. Boone," he said softly. "Good night, Mr. Boone," she replied, and for the first time since their wedding day, the name felt completely natural. In her room, their room, she was beginning to think of it. Clara lay awake, listening to the night sounds of the mountain and thinking about the changes 3 days had brought to her life. She was no longer the helpless daughter of a debtor, dependent on others for her survival. She was Clara Boone, wife to a mountain man, defender of her own home, a woman with a rifle and the knowledge of how to use it. Outside, an owl called to its mate, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the moon. But inside the cabin, surrounded by thick walls and protected by a man who had sworn to defend her with his life, Clara felt safer than she had in months. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, and the wanted poster crumpled in Silas's pocket was a reminder that their troubles were far from over. But tonight, for the first time since their hasty wedding, Clara allowed herself to believe that they might actually survive this, not just as individuals, but as a couple who had chosen to face whatever came together. A week passed in deceptive tranquility. Clara settled into the rhythm of mountain life with surprising ease, rising before dawn to tend the fire and prepare breakfast, while Silas checked his snares and hunting trails. Her city shoes had been relegated to a corner of the bedroom, replaced by sturdy boots Silas had crafted from elk hide, their soft leather molded to her feet like a second skin. She was grinding coffee beans on the cabin's front porch when she noticed Silas standing motionless at the edge of the clearing, his entire body tense with alert attention. In his hands was a spyglass, and he was scanning the valley below with the focused intensity of a man who had learned to read danger in the landscape itself. "What is it?" Clara asked, setting down the coffee grinder and moving to his side. "Riders," Silas said without lowering the spyglass. "3 of them, maybe 4, about 2 miles down the main trail. They're trying to look casual, but they're studying every fork in the path, like they're searching for something specific." Clara felt her heart begin to race, Are they coming this way? Not yet, but they're close enough to the turnoff that leads up here. Silas collapsed the spyglass and tucked it into his belt. We need to be ready. The next hour passed in swift, efficient preparation. Clara loaded both rifles, while Silas secured anything outside the cabin that might indicate their presence. The laundry line, tools that had been left in the yard, even the wood chips from his morning chopping. Within minutes, the homestead looked abandoned, as if no one had lived there for months. "Remember what we practiced," Silas said as they took their positions at the cabin windows. "Don't shoot unless I give the signal, and if shooting starts, aim for center mass. Don't try to be fancy." Clara nodded, checking her rifle's load for the third time. Her hands were steady, but she could feel her pulse hammering in her throat. Through the window, she had a clear view of the narrow trail that led up to their clearing, the only approach that didn't require scaling sheer rock faces. They waited. The silence stretched until Clara began to wonder if she'd imagined the tension in Silas's voice. Then she heard it, the soft clip-clop of horses picking their way carefully up the rocky trail, the creak of leather saddles, and the low murmur of men's voices. "Stay calm," Silas whispered from his position at the front window. "Let me do the talking." 3 men emerged from the tree line, leading their horses rather than riding them up the treacherous final approach. They were dressed like cowboys, but something in their movement suggested they were more than simple ranch hands. The way they spread out without discussing it, the casual way their hands rested near their gunsheaths, were men who knew their business. The leader was a lean man with a drooping mustache and eyes that missed nothing. He called out when they were still 50 yards from the cabin, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Hello, the house. We're looking for information about a missing woman, Clara Wynn. Her family's awful worried about her." Silas remained silent, watching through a crack in the shutters as the men moved closer. Clara could see his jaw clench when the leader mentioned her name. "We know someone's up here," the man continued, still advancing. "Saw smoke from your chimney yesterday. Just want to ask a few questions. Make sure the lady's all right." "That's close enough," Silas called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "State your business and move on." The 3 men stopped, but Clara noticed they positioned themselves so they couldn't all be targeted from a single window. "Professional, definitely." "Name's Carter," the leader said. "I'm a deputy territorial marshal, and these are my associates. We're conducting an official investigation into the disappearance of Miss Clara Wynn from Cedar Falls. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" "I know she got married legal and proper in front of half the town," Silas replied. "What she does after that is her business and her husband's." Carter's expression hardened. "Her family says she was coerced, forced into marriage against her will by a wanted man. That makes it our business." "Show me a warrant," Silas demanded. There was a pause. Then Carter laughed a sound with no humor in it. "We don't need a warrant to ask questions, friend. But we've got authority to search any property where we suspect a crime's been committed." Clara felt her grip tighten on the rifle. Through her window, she could see one of Carter's associates moving slowly to the left, trying to get an angle on the cabin's side windows. The careful way he moved suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. "You can ask your questions from where you stand," Silas said. "But you take one more step toward this cabin, and we're going to have a problem." "We?" Carter asked, his voice sharpening with interest. "Who's we, Mr. Boone? You got someone in there with you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Clara realized that her presence in the cabin had just been confirmed, and with it, Silas's guilt in the eyes of these men. "Mrs. Boone is under my protection," Silas said carefully. "She's exactly where she wants to be. Why don't we let the lady speak for herself?" Carter suggested. "Mrs. Boone, if you can hear me, just come out and talk to us. If you're here of your own free will, we'll apologize for the intrusion and be on our way." Clara looked toward Silas's window, waiting for his signal. But he was focused entirely on the men outside, his rifle barrel resting on the windowsill in clear warning. The silence stretched until Carter's patience apparently ran out. "All right, boys," he said to his companions. "Looks like we're going to have to do this the hard way." Clara saw the deputy on the left start to move toward the cabin's blind spot, and she knew their time for talking was over. But before she could warn Silas, another voice cut through the tension female, clear and stronger than she'd expected. "I can speak for myself, thank you." The words were out of Clara's mouth before she fully realized she'd spoken. Through her window, she saw all three men turn toward the sound of her voice, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. "Ma'am," Carter called out, his tone shifting to something meant to be reassuring. "Are you Mrs. Clara Wynn?" "I'm Mrs. Clara Boone," she replied, emphasizing the surname. "And I'm exactly where I choose to be. Your family's worried about you, ma'am. They say you were forced into marriage against your will." Clara felt a flash of anger hot enough to surprise her. "My family is dead, Mr. Carter. The only person who was worried about me was Harold Fitzgerald, and his concern had more to do with money than my welfare." "Be that as it may," Carter said, "we've got reports that suggest you might be in danger. Why don't you come out here so we can see that you're all right? So you can drag me back to Cedar Falls and hand me over to the banker who tried to buy me like livestock." Clara's voice carried a bite that made even Silas glance toward her window in surprise. "I think not." She could feel the shift in the men's attitudes, the way their casual deference transformed into something harder and more determined. They'd come here expecting to find a helpless victim grateful for rescue. Instead, they'd found a woman who sounded very much like she was defending her home against invaders. "Mrs. Boone," Carter said, his tone losing all pretense of friendliness, "I'm afraid I'm going to have to insist that you come with us. There are serious questions about the circumstances of your marriage, and they need to be answered in a proper court of law." "The only serious question," Clara replied, "is why three armed men think they have the right to invade private property and threaten a legally married woman." She could see Silas's shoulders shake slightly, and she realized he was struggling not to laugh, despite the danger they faced. The sound gave her courage to continue. "But if you're concerned about my welfare," she added, "you should know that I've learned to shoot quite well since coming to the mountain, and unlike my husband, I don't have a reputation for mercy to maintain." The threat hung in the mountain air like the promise of a storm. Carter and his men exchanged glances that spoke of quick decisions and changed plans. "All right, Mrs. Boone," Carter said finally, "you've made your position clear, but this isn't over. There are people in Cedar Falls who won't accept your word alone, and they've got the law on their side." "Then let them come with proper warrants and legal authority," Clara replied. "But next time, they'd better bring more men." The deputy marshal's face flushed red at the insult, but after a long moment, he gestured to his companions. "Mount up, boys. We've got what we came for." As the three men retreated down the trail, Clara felt her legs begin to shake with reaction. She just threatened three armed lawmen, defended her home like it was a fortress, and discovered she had a talent for defiance she'd never suspected. "That," Silas said from across the room, his voice filled with something that might have been pride, "was magnificent." Clara looked toward his window, seeing his face clearly for the first time since the confrontation began. In his eyes was an expression that made her breath catch, not just approval or gratitude, but something deeper and more complex. "Was it foolish?" she asked. "Probably," Silas admitted, "but also brave, and exactly what needed to be said." He moved away from the window, his rifle still in his hands, but no longer ready for immediate use. "They'll be back, though, and next time, they'll bring more men and better plans." Clara nodded, understanding that this had been only the first test of their determination to stay together. "How long do we have?" "Days, maybe a week if we're lucky." Silas leaned his rifle against the wall and moved toward her, his expression serious. "Clara, what I said earlier about having places to run." "I told you," she interrupted. "I'm not running. This is our home, and I'm not letting anyone take it from us." Silas reached out and took her hands in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Even if it means fighting? Even if people get hurt?" Clara thought about her father's locket, still hanging around her neck, and the way Harold Fitzgerald had looked at her like property he intended to claim. She thought about this cabin that Silas had built with his own hands, and the way she'd come to think of it as the first real home she'd had since childhood. "Especially then," she said quietly. "Some things are worth fighting for." Silas lifted her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles with a tenderness that made her heart race. "Then we'd better get ready," he said, "because I have a feeling our quiet days on this mountain are about to come to an end." 2 days after the marshal's visit, Clara was organizing the cabin's small pantry when she found the blood-stained letter wedged behind a loose board in the wall. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a piece of paper that had been used to patch a gap in the wood, but when she worked it free, she realized it was something far more significant. The letter was addressed to her father in Harold Fitzgerald's distinctive handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before Thomas Wynn's death. Clara's hands shook as she unfolded it, noting the dark stains that could only be blood, and the way the paper had been hastily folded, as if someone had hidden it in a hurry. "Thomas," the letter began, "your continued refusal to accept my generous offer leaves me no choice but to take more direct action. The debts you owe are real, and the consequences of non-payment are severe. Meet me at the old mining office tomorrow night at 9 o'clock. Come alone, and we can discuss a final settlement. Fail to appear, and I will be forced to collect in ways that may prove unpleasant for all concerned. H. Fitzgerald." Clara read the letter 3 times before its full implications sank in. The date was written the night before her father had been found dead in his bed, supposedly succumbed to fever. But there had been no fever, no illness that anyone could remember. Her father had simply gone to sleep healthy and failed to wake up, a tragedy everyone attributed to his weak heart and the stress of his financial troubles. "Silas," she called, her voice carrying a tremor she couldn't control. He appeared in the doorway immediately, alerted by something in her tone. "What is it?" Clara handed him the letter without speaking, watching his face as he read. She saw his expression darken with each word, his jaw clenching until she could see the muscles jumping beneath his beard. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. "Behind the pantry shelves, wedged into a crack in the wall. Someone hid it there, someone who knew what it meant and wanted to keep it safe." Silas turned the letter over in his hands, studying the bloodstains and the hastily scrawled words. "This is evidence of murder, Clara. Your father didn't die of fever or a weak heart. Fitzgerald killed him, and this letter proves premeditation." Clara felt something cold and hard settle in her chestnut grief, which she'd already worked through, but fury. "He murdered my father, then tried to force me into marriage to cover his tracks. The debts, the wedding auction, all of it was never about money. It was about making sure I couldn't ask questions about how my father really died." "The question is, who hid this letter here?" Silas said, studying the blood-stained paper. "And why in our cabin?" Clara thought about the timing, the carefully folded paper, the way it had been concealed behind a board that looked loose but was actually wedged tight. It had to be someone who knew about this place, someone who could get up here without being seen, and someone who wanted to make sure the truth came out eventually. Silas added, "This isn't the hiding place of someone who wanted the evidence destroyed. This is someone who wanted it preserved." They spent the afternoon searching the cabin more thoroughly, looking for other signs that someone had been there before them. What they found painted a picture that neither of them had expected. In the root cellar, tucked behind a barrel of salt pork, they discovered a small cache of supplies, coffee, ammunition, and a bag of gold coins. Hidden under a loose floorboard near the fireplace was a second letter, this one in a different handwriting and addressed to Silas. "If you're reading this," the letter began, "then Clara found the evidence I left for her, and you've both figured out that Thomas Wynn was murdered. My name is Jacob Morrison. I was the night clerk at Fitzgerald's bank, and I saw things I shouldn't have seen. By the time you read this, I'll probably be dead, but I wanted someone to know the truth." Clara gasped. "Morrison, that's the name of the girl at the wedding auction. Sarah Morrison." "His daughter," Silas said grimly, continuing to read. He says here that Fitzgerald killed your father because Thomas discovered the banker had been embezzling from the town's emergency fund. Your father threatened to expose him, so Fitzgerald lured him to a meeting and poisoned him with arsenic. The letter went on to detail other crimes loans that were never actually made but still collected on, foreclosures on properties that weren't actually in default, and a pattern of theft and fraud that went back years. Jacob Morrison had documented it all, keeping careful records of Fitzgerald's crimes, while the banker thought he was just a harmless old man who cleaned the offices at night. Morrison knew he was in danger, Silas said, reaching the end of the letter. He says Fitzgerald was getting suspicious, asking questions about who had access to the bank records. So he gathered all the evidence he could, hid copies in several places, and waited. "But why here?" Clara asked. "Why our cabin?" The answer came in the letter's final paragraph. "I've heard stories about Silas Boone, about what happened with the Kellermans and why he went to the mountain. People call him a killer, but I knew his father, and I know what kind of man raised him. If something happens to me, I'm trusting that the mountain man will do right by my evidence and my daughter. There's no law in Cedar Falls that Fitzgerald can't buy, but there's still justice in men who remember what it means to protect the innocent." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she thought about Jacob Morrison, a quiet night clerk who had risked everything to gather evidence against a corrupt banker. "He died trying to protect his daughter from the same fate I faced. And he succeeded," Silas said, folding the letter carefully. "Sarah Morrison was matched with a rancher, not Fitzgerald. The old man made sure his daughter had a way out, even if he couldn't save himself." Clara stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the mountain landscape that had become her home. "We have to go back," she said quietly. "What?" "We have to go back to Cedar Falls. This evidence, it's not just about my father anymore. It's about every family Fitzgerald has destroyed, every person he's cheated or threatened or killed. We can't just hide up here while he continues to hurt people." Silas was quiet for a long moment, studying her profile against the window light. "Going back means facing those marshals again. It means walking into a town where half the people think I'm a dangerous fugitive and the other half are afraid to cross Fitzgerald." "I know," Clara said, turning to face him. "But it also means clearing your name and mine. It means making sure Harold Fitzgerald pays for what he's done, not just to us, but to everyone. It's dangerous, Clara. More dangerous than staying here and defending our mountain." Clara walked back to where he sat, taking his hands in hers. "You told me once that some things are worth fighting for. Well, this is one of them. Justice for my father, protection for people like Sarah Morrison, and the right to live our lives without looking over our shoulders for marshals with false warrants." Silas studied her face, seeing the determination there and the strength that had grown over their weeks together. This wasn't the frightened woman who had stood at the altar in a borrowed wedding dress. This was Clara Boone, his partner and equal, a woman who had found her courage and was ready to use it. "When do we leave?" he asked. "Tomorrow," Clara said without hesitation, "before Fitzgerald has time to consolidate his position or silence any other witnesses." That night, they made their preparations with the methodical care of people who understood the stakes. Clara packed the evidence in a waterproof pouch, including both letters and several of the documents Jacob Morrison had hidden with them. Silas cleaned and loaded their weapons, checking every mechanism and counting their ammunition twice. "There's something else we need to discuss," Silas said as they worked. "Once we go back down that mountain, everything changes between us." Clara looked up from the supplies she was organizing. "What do you mean?" "I mean that up here, we've been able to take our time, to let our marriage grow naturally without pressure from outside. But down there, in front of the whole town, we're going to have to present a united front. People are going to be watching us, judging whether our marriage is real or just a convenient arrangement." Clara felt her cheeks warm, understanding the implication. "Are you asking if I'm prepared to be your wife in every sense of the word?" "I'm asking if you want to be," Silas said quietly. "Because if we're going to convince anyone that what we have is real, it has to actually be real." No more sleeping in separate spaces, no more polite distance. We'll be partners in every way that matters. Clara thought about the past weeks, about the gradual deepening of trust and affection between them. She thought about the way her heart raced when he smiled at her, the way she felt safe and protected in his presence, and the growing certainty that what had started as a marriage of convenience had become something much more precious. "Yes," she said simply, "I want to be your wife, Silas, in every way that matters." Something shifted in his expression: surprise, relief, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. He reached for her then, cupping her face in his hands with the same gentle care he'd shown that first day in the church. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Because once we take this step, there's no going back. You'll be mine, Clara, and I'll be yours, and not all the marshals and bankers in the territory will be able to change that." "I'm sure," Clara whispered, rising on her toes to close the distance between them. Their second kiss was nothing like their first. Where that had been desperate and public and driven by impulse, this was slow and deliberate and private, the kiss of two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of what that choice meant. When they finally broke apart, Clara felt something settle into place in her chest, a sense of completeness she'd never experienced before. Tomorrow they would face danger and uncertainty, but tonight they were simply husband and wife, bound together by choice and sealed by a love that had grown in the mountain air like wildflowers, finding purchase in rocky soil. The blood-stained letter lay on the table nearby, evidence of murder and corruption that would change everything. But for now, in the warm light of their cabin, Clara and Silas held each other and prepared to face whatever came next as partners in the truest sense of the word. Dawn broke grey and cold over Elkhorn Ridge, the mountain mist clinging to the valleys like smoke from a dying fire. Clara stood on the cabin porch for the last time, watching the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold, while Silas loaded their horses with the supplies they would need for the journey down. In her hands was his grandfather's rifle weapon that had seen 3 generations of Boone men through wars and feuds and frontier justice. The wood was worn smooth by decades of handling, and the metal bore the patina of age and careful maintenance. Silas had presented it to her the night before, along with the leather bandolier that held its ammunition. "It belonged to my grandfather during the war," he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of family history. "My father carried it when he fought the Kellermans, and I've used it to keep this mountain safe for 10 years. Now it's yours, Clara. Use it to protect what matters." The rifle felt heavy in her hands, not just with physical weight, but with the responsibility it represented. She was no longer the helpless daughter of a debtor, dependent on others for protection. She was Clara Boone, armed and dangerous, and ready to fight for justice. "Ready?" Silas asked, leading the horses around to the front of the cabin. Clara took one last look at their home, the solid walls Silas had built with his own hands, the windows that caught the morning light, the porch where they'd shared quiet evenings and learned to trust each other. It might be days or weeks before they saw it again, if they ever did. "Ready," she said, shouldering the rifle and walking down the steps to her horse. The descent down the mountain was treacherous in the early morning light, the trail slick with dew and shadows that concealed loose rocks and sudden drops. But both horses were sure-footed mountain animals, and they picked their way carefully down the narrow switchbacks that led toward the valley floor. As they rode, Silas shared what he knew about the current situation in Cedar Falls. Carter and his deputies had returned to town after their failed attempt to retrieve Clara, but they'd left behind a network of informants and paid watchers. Fitzgerald had also hired additional Mengun fighters and bounty hunters who weren't constrained by the legal niceties that bound territorial marshals. "He's turning Cedar Falls into an armed camp," Silas explained as they navigated a particularly difficult section of trail. "Anyone who might be sympathetic to us has been threatened or bought off. The ones who can't be intimidated are being watched so closely they can't move without Fitzgerald knowing about it." "What about Father Mackenzie?" Clara asked. "He performed our wedding ceremony. Surely he'll testify that it was legal and consensual." Silas's expression darkened. Mackenzie left town 3 days after our wedding. Word is he received a better offer from a parish in California, but people talk. They say he looked scared when he packed up his things. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If Fitzgerald was willing to drive away a priest to prevent testimony that might support their case, what lengths would he go to silence them permanently? They rode in contemplative silence for the next hour, each lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. The trail gradually widened as they descended, joining with other paths that led down from the high country. Soon they would reach the main road that connected Cedar Falls with the outside world, and their approach to the town would be observed and reported within minutes. "There's something I need to tell you," Clara said as they paused to rest the horses at a stream crossing, "about what happens if we don't succeed." Silas looked up from where he was checking his horse's hooves. "We'll succeed. But if we don't," Clara pressed on, "if Fitzgerald's corruption runs deeper than we think, if the evidence isn't enough, I want you to know that I don't regret any of it. Not the marriage, not coming to your mountain, not this decision to fight back. Whatever happens, I'm glad I got to know the man behind the reputation." Silas straightened slowly, his grey eyes serious. "Clara, let me finish," she said. "I spent my whole life being careful, doing what was expected, following the rules that other people made for me. But these past weeks with you, I've never felt more alive, more like the person I was meant to be. You gave me that, Silas. You gave me the courage to be myself." Silas crossed to where she stood and took her hands in his, the familiar roughness of his palms comforting against her skin. "You had that courage all along?" he said quietly. "I just gave you a reason to use it." He leaned down and kissed her then, a gentle kiss that tasted of coffee and mountain air and the promise of a future they might not live to see. When they broke apart, Clara felt the familiar warmth spread through her chest, the feeling that had grown stronger every day since their awkward beginning. "I love you," she said, the words coming easily despite their magnitude. "I know we started this as strangers, but somewhere along the way—" "I love you too," Silas said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I thought I could love anyone after Mary left. You brought me back to life, Clara Boone." They held each other beside the mountain stream, surrounded by the wilderness that had become their sanctuary, preparing to leave it behind for a confrontation that would determine not just their fate, but the future of everyone Harold Fitzgerald had wronged. The final approach to Cedar Falls required careful planning. They couldn't simply ride into town in broad daylight. Too many people were watching for them, and Fitzgerald's hired guns would have orders to shoot first and ask questions later. Instead, they circled wide around the town's perimeter, approaching from the east where the old mining road provided cover among the abandoned claims. "Remember," Silas said as they dismounted in a grove of cottonwoods that provided concealment while giving them a clear view of the town, "our first priority is getting the evidence to someone who can act on it. Judge Harrison from the Territorial Court is supposed to be in town today. If we can reach him before Fitzgerald knows we're here, we might have a chance." Clara checked the waterproof pouch that contained Jacob Morrison's letters and the other evidence they'd discovered. "And if we can't reach the judge, then we make sure the whole town hears what we have to say," Silas replied grimly. "Sometimes the court of public opinion is the only justice available." They spent the afternoon observing the town from their hidden position, noting the unusual number of armed men posted at strategic locations. Fitzgerald had indeed turned Cedar Falls into an armed camp, with guards at the hotel where Judge Harrison was staying, watchers on every road leading into town, and suspicious-looking men lounging near the church, the general store, and anywhere else townspeople might gather. "It's going to be like walking into a trap," Clara observed, watching a man with a rifle pace back and forth in front of the hotel. "Every trap has a weakness," Silas said, lowering his spyglass. "Fitzgerald's hired professionals, but they don't know this town the way we do. They're watching the obvious approaches, but there are other ways in." As evening approached, they finalized their plan. Clara would enter town first, using the old mining tunnels that connected to the basement of Morrison's Houseno, empty since the old clerk's death. From there, she could make her way to the hotel and attempt to contact Judge Harrison directly. Meanwhile, Silas would create a distraction on the opposite side of town, drawing Fitzgerald's attention and splitting his forces. "It's risky," Silas admitted as they prepared to separate. "If something goes wrong, if they catch you before you can deliver the evidence, then you continue the fight without me," Clara said firmly. "This is bigger than just us now, Silas. Too many people have suffered because of Fitzgerald's crimes." Silas cupped her face in his hands, his eyes intense in the gathering dusk. "Promise me something," he said. "If it comes down to choosing between justice and survival, choose survival. I can't lose you, Clara. Not now. Not when I've just found what it means to live again." "Only if you promise me the same thing," Clara replied. "We both go home to our mountain, or neither of us do." They sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of determination and desperation in equal measure, then began their approach to the town that held their fate in its streets and shadows. Clara's journey through the abandoned mining tunnels was a nightmare of crawling through spaces barely wide enough for her body, following directions Silas had given her based on childhood exploration 30 years earlier. The tunnels smelled of damp earth and decay, and more than once she had to stop and control her breathing when the weight of rock above her became overwhelming. But the route worked. She emerged in the basement of the Morrison house just as full darkness settled over Cedar Falls, her clothes filthy and her hands scraped from climbing over fallen timbers. The house above was empty and cold, its windows dark and its rooms filled with the ghosts of a man who had died trying to do the right thing. From the Morrison house, Clara could see the hotel where Judge Harrison was staying. Lights burned in several windows, and she could make out the silhouettes of guards posted at both the front and rear entrances. Getting inside would require timing, luck, and a plan that bordered on the desperate. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of town, Silas was preparing his own approach. His grandfather's rifle was loaded and ready, and he carried enough ammunition to hold off a small army if necessary. But he wasn't planning to fight unless forced to. His job was distraction, not destruction. The abandoned church at the edge of town provided the perfect platform for his purposes. It had been struck by lightning the previous summer and left to rot, its bell tower still standing but its roof partially collapsed. From the tower, he would have a commanding view of the entire town and the ability to make noise that would draw every gunfighter in Cedar Falls away from the hotel. As he climbed the rickety stairs to the bell tower, Silas thought about the irony of their situation. He and Clara had been married in a church, and now their fate might well be decided in another one, this abandoned shell that no longer housed anything but memories and birds' nests. At exactly 9 o'clock, Clara made her move. She slipped from the Morrison house and crossed the narrow alley to the hotel's rear entrance, timing her approach to coincide with the guards' routine patrol around the building. The back door was locked, but the window beside it was merely latched, and she was small enough to slip through without making a sound. The hotel's back stairs led directly to the second floor, where Judge Harrison was staying according to the register she'd glimpsed through the front window. She climbed carefully, avoiding the steps she knew would creak, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone in the building could hear it. Room 7. She found it at the end of the hallway, a thin line of light visible under the door. Clara paused, gathering her courage for what might be the most important conversation of her life, then knocked softly. "Judge Harrison," she whispered. "My name is Clara Boone, and I have evidence of murder that you need to see." The response was immediate, the scrape of a chair, footsteps crossing the room, and the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened to reveal a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that quickly took in Clara's disheveled appearance. "Mrs. Boone," he said quietly, "I was wondering when you would appear. Please, come in quickly." Clara slipped into the room, surprised by his lack of surprise at her presence. "You were expecting me?" Judge Harrison closed and bolted the door before answering. "I've been hearing interesting stories since I arrived in Cedar Falls," he said. Stories about a banker who's accumulated unusual wealth, about a woman who allegedly disappeared against her will, and about a mountain man who may not be the criminal he's been painted as. I was beginning to think I might need to investigate these stories myself. Clara felt a surge of hope as she pulled the waterproof pouch from inside her jacket. "Then you'll want to see this," she said, spreading Jacob Morrison's evidence across the judge's desk. As Judge Harrison examined the blood-stained letters and documents, his expression grew increasingly grim. "This is damning evidence," he said finally. "If even half of what Morrison documented is true, Harold Fitzgerald has been running a criminal enterprise for years." "It's all true," Clara said. "And there's more. He murdered my father to cover up his embezzlement, then tried to force me into marriage to ensure my silence." Judge Harrison looked up from the papers, his eyes hard as flint. "Mrs. Boone, if you're willing to testify to these facts under oath, I can issue warrants tonight that will put an end to Fitzgerald's operation." Clara felt relief flood through her, so intense it made her knees weak. They'd done it. The evidence had been delivered, and justice would finally... The sound of gunfire from across town cut through her triumph like a blade. Single shots at first, then the rapid crack of multiple rifles as Silas's distraction turned into something far more deadly than either of them had planned. "That's my husband," Clara said, moving toward the window. "I have to." "You have to stay here and complete your testimony," Judge Harrison said firmly. "If your husband is half the man you believe him to be, he'll want you to finish what you started." More gunfire echoed through the night, and Clara pressed her hand to the window glass, her heart torn between duty and love. Somewhere in the darkness, Silas was fighting for both their lives, trusting her to complete their mission, while he held off whatever forces Fitzgerald had sent against them. "Tell me everything," Judge Harrison said, settling behind his desk with a pen and paper. "Start from the beginning, and don't leave out a single detail. Tonight, we're going to bring Harold Fitzgerald's reign of terror to an end." As Clara began her testimony, the sound of battle continued to rage across Cedar Falls, and she could only pray that when morning came, she and Silas would both be alive to see the justice they'd fought so hard to achieve. The church bell that had witnessed their wedding 3 weeks earlier now told a different kind of ceremony, the death knell of Harold Fitzgerald's criminal empire. Judge Harrison's warrants had been signed in the pre-dawn hours, and by sunrise, a dozen territorial marshals surrounded the banker's mansion, while the legitimate law enforcement officers of Cedar Falls found themselves with a choice: stand with justice or fall with corruption. Clara stood beside the judge on the courthouse steps, her testimony complete and her evidence legally entered into the territorial record. The morning sun painted the town in gold and shadow, but the beauty of the dawn was overshadowed by the knowledge that Silas was still missing. The gunfight that had raged through the night had ended in an eerie silence, and no one seemed to know whether her husband was alive or dead. "Mrs. Boone," Judge Harrison said quietly, "I want you to know that your courage in bringing this evidence forward has prevented countless future crimes. Whatever happens today, you've served justice admirably." Clara nodded, though her attention was focused on the crowd gathering in the town square. Word of the warrants had spread quickly through Cedar Falls, and people were emerging from their homes to witness the fall of the man who had controlled their lives for so long. "There," Judge Harrison said, pointing toward the mansion at the end of Main Street. "They're bringing him out." Harold Fitzgerald emerged from his house in handcuffs, flanked by 2 marshals, and looking nothing like the powerful banker who had tried to buy Clara at auction. His usually immaculate clothes were wrinkled and stained, his pale skin had taken on a sickly pallor, and his eyes darted nervously over the crowd, as if searching for allies who were no longer there. The procession moved slowly down Main Street, giving everyone in Cedar Falls a chance to see their former tormentor brought low. Clara watched the faces in the crowd, some showing satisfaction, others displaying relief, and a few revealing the kind of fear that comes from realizing how close they'd come to disaster. "Where is Silas?" Clara asked Marshal Carter, who had surprisingly turned out to be one of the honest lawmen once Judge Harrison revealed the extent of Fitzgerald's corruption. "We're still looking for him, ma'am." Carter replied, his tone apologetic. The shooting last night was heavy, and there's been some confusion about who was on which side. Clara felt her heart clench with worry. The plan had called for Silas to create a distraction, not to engage in a prolonged gun battle. If he'd been forced to fight, if he'd been wounded or worse. Clara. The voice cut through her dark thoughts, like sunlight through storm clouds. She turned to see Silas pushing through the crowd, his clothes torn and blood on his face, but alive and walking under his own power. Without thinking, she ran to him, throwing herself into his arms with such force that he staggered backward. "I thought you were dead," she whispered against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke and mountain air that meant home and safety. "Takes more than a few hired guns to kill a Boone," Silas replied, his arms tightening around her. Though it was touch and go for a while, Fitzgerald had more men than we expected, and they were better organized. Over Silas's shoulder, Clara could see the banker being led toward the courthouse, his face a mask of rage and desperation. When Fitzgerald spotted them embracing in the crowd, his expression twisted into something ugly and vindictive. "This isn't over," he shouted, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "You think you've won, but I have friends in high places, connections that reach all the way to the territorial capital. I'll be free within a week, and when I am—" "Mr. Fitzgerald," Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of territorial law, "I suggest you save your energy for your trial. Based on the evidence presented this morning, you'll be facing charges of murder, embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Your friends in high places will find it difficult to help you when the federal marshals take over your case." The banker's face went white as the implications sank in. Federal charges meant federal courts, far beyond the reach of his local corruption network. For the first time since Clara had known him, Harold Fitzgerald looked genuinely afraid. "You can't prove anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Morrison's dead, and his testimony won't hold up in court." "Morrison's testimony isn't all we have," Clara said, stepping forward with her hand still in Silas's. "We found his evidence, Mr. Fitzgerald. All of it, including the blood-stained letter you sent my father the night you murdered him." The crowd gasped at the revelation, and Clara saw recognition dawn on several faces, people who had wondered about Thomas Wynn's sudden death but had been too afraid to ask questions. Fitzgerald's mask of composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand what you've done," he snarled. "The money I took, the deals I made, they kept this town alive. Without me, Cedar Falls will dry up and blow away. Better a poor town than a corrupted one," Judge Harrison said firmly. "Marshal Carter, please escort Mr. Fitzgerald to his cell. We have a great deal of evidence to process before his trial." As the disgraced banker was led away, the crowd began to disperse, people talking in excited whispers about the morning's revelations. Clara and Silas found themselves standing alone in the square that had witnessed both their wedding and Fitzgerald's downfall, the church bell still visible in the distance. "It's really over," Clara said, hardly daring to believe it. "The legal part is," Silas agreed. "But there's still one more thing we need to do." He led her toward the church where they'd first met, their footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalk. Inside, Father Mackenzie's replacement, a young priest named Father O'Brien, was preparing for morning services. "Father," Silas said, "I was wondering if you might perform a service for us." The priest looked confused. "But you're already married. I have the record right here in the church registry." "We are married," Clara said, understanding what Silas wanted. "But our first wedding was hasty. We'd like to exchange vows again, properly this time, with clear consciences and honest hearts." Father O'Brien smiled, recognizing the importance of the moment. "I would be honored to perform a renewal of vows for the couple who brought justice to Cedar Falls." As they stood once again at the altar, where their strange love story had begun, Clara thought about everything that had changed in just 3 weeks. She was no longer the frightened woman in a borrowed dress, and Silas was no longer the lonely exile who had lived apart from human connection for a decade. "Do you, Silas Boone, take Clara to be your wife, in joy and sorrow, in hardship and plenty, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Silas said, his voice strong and sure. And do you, Clara Boone, take Silas to be your husband, in joy and sorrow, in hardship and plenty, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Clara replied, meaning it with every fibre of her being. When Father O'Brien pronounced them husband and wife for the second time, their kiss was witnessed not by a shocked and fearful crowd, but by the warm morning sunlight streaming through the church windows and the knowledge that they had fought for their love and won. Outside, the church bell began to ring again, not in alarm or summons, but in celebration. The sound echoed across Cedar Falls and up into the mountains, carrying the news that justice had been served and love had triumphed over corruption. Clara and Silas walked out of the church hand in hand, ready to return to their mountain home as partners in every sense of the word. Behind them, the town they had helped to free was already beginning the long process of healing, while ahead lay the wilderness sanctuary, where their unlikely love had grown into something strong enough to move mountains. The church bell continued to ring as they mounted their horses and headed toward the mountain trail, its bronze voice joining the morning chorus of birds and wind and rushing water, the sound of a world made new by courage, love, and the unshakable belief that some things are worth fighting for. The confrontation that would define their future came not in the courtroom or the town square, but on the mountain trail leading home. Clara and Silas had ridden barely 2 miles from Cedar Falls when they found their path blocked by 5 armed men who had positioned themselves at a narrow pass where escape would be impossible. At their head was a man Clara recognized with a sinking heart. Vincent Kellerman, youngest son of the family patriarch Silas, had killed 10 years earlier. He was older now, scarred by a decade of hatred and the burning need for revenge that had consumed his life since that bloody night on Boone land. "Hello, Silas," Vincent said, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded violence. "I've been waiting a long time for this moment." Silas reined in his horse, positioning himself slightly ahead of Clara in an instinctively protective gesture. "Vincent," he acknowledged, "I wondered when you'd finally work up the courage to face me." "Courage?" Vincent laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You killed my father and my brothers, destroyed my family, and then ran off to hide in these mountains like a coward. Don't talk to me about courage." Clara could feel the tension radiating from Silas, the careful control he was maintaining in the face of provocation designed to make him lose his temper. She remembered the stories he'd told her about the Kellerman feud, the injustices that had driven him to violence, and the guilt he'd carried ever since. "Your father came to my land with rope and torches," Silas said quietly. "Your brothers rode with him. I gave them a chance to leave peacefully. You murdered them in cold blood," Vincent snarled, his hand moving toward his gun. "I defended my family and my property," Silas replied, his own voice hardening. "Same as any man would do. Same as you'd do if someone came for what was yours." Clara watched the interplay between the two men, recognizing that this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment she and Silas had chosen to return to civilization. Vincent Kellerman represented the past that Silas could never fully escape, the violence that had shaped him and driven him into exile. But something had changed in the equation. Silas was no longer alone. He had someone to protect, someone whose life was worth more to him than settling old scores. And Clara had her own part to play in this drama. "Mr. Kellerman," she said, spurring her horse forward until she was beside Silas rather than behind him. "I'm sorry for your loss, but what happened 10 years ago has nothing to do with me, and it doesn't have to end in more bloodshed today." Vincent's eyes flicked to her with interest and contempt. "The famous Mrs. Boone," he said, "the woman who married a killer and helped him escape justice. Tell me, do you know how your husband murdered my family? Do you know what he's capable of when the mood takes him?" "I know he's capable of protecting the people he loves," Clara replied steadily. "I know he's capable of building something beautiful instead of destroying it. And I know that revenge will never bring your family back or heal the pain you've been carrying all these years." "Pretty words," Vincent said, "but they won't save him. Or you." The threat hung in the mountain air like smoke from a gun barrel. Clara felt Silas tense beside her, preparing for the violence that seemed inevitable. But she also felt something else, the weight of the new wedding ring he'd fashioned for her, from mountain silver, a symbol of their renewed commitment and the life they'd chosen to build together. The ring had been his idea, crafted in the long hours while she gave her testimony to Judge Harrison. He'd worked the silver with his own hands, shaping it into something that bore no resemblance to the borrowed dress and hastily signed certificate that had marked their first wedding. This ring was personal, intentional, and uniquely theirs. "You're right," Clara said, pulling off her gloves and holding up her left hand so the silver ring caught the morning light. "Pretty words won't save us, but love might." She dismounted from her horse, ignoring Silas's sharp intake of breath and Vincent's surprised curse. Standing in the narrow mountain pass with 5 armed men blocking their path, Clara Boone did something that would be talked about in Cedar Falls for generations to come. She walked directly to Vincent Kellerman and held out her hand. "My name is Clara," she said simply, "and I'd like to know yours, not the name of the man seeking revenge, but the name your mother called you when you were small." Vincent stared at her extended hand, as if it were a snake that might bite him. "What kind of trick is this?" "No trick," Clara said. "Just a woman trying to understand why you're willing to die today for something that happened before I was even born." "You don't understand." "I understand loss," Clara interrupted gently. "I understand rage, and the need for justice, and the way grief can eat at a person until there's nothing left but the hunger for revenge. I understand all of that because I felt it too, when I learned that Harold Fitzgerald murdered my father." Something flickered in Vincent's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "Then you know why I have to do this." "I know why you think you have to do this," Clara corrected, "but I also know what I chose to do instead. I chose to fight for justice rather than revenge, to build something instead of destroying it, to honor my father's memory by living the kind of life he would have been proud of." She gestured towards Silas, who was watching the conversation with the focused intensity of a man ready to act at the first sign of treachery. "Your father and brothers died because they chose violence over law, revenge over justice. Don't make the same choice they did." Vincent's hand had moved away from his gun, though his men remained ready for action. "You're asking me to forget 10 years of hatred. I'm asking you to remember 10 years of pain," Clara said, "and to decide if you want to spend the next 10 years the same way." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind through the pines and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Clara stood in the center of the pass, surrounded by armed men, but somehow commanding the moment through nothing more than her willingness to speak truth to violence. Finally, Vincent Kellerman looked directly at Silas. "You killed them," he said simply. "Yes?" Silas replied without flinching. "I killed them because they gave me no choice, but I've carried the weight of those deaths every day since, and I wouldn't wish that burden on any man." "Good," Vincent said, "because living with what you've done is worse punishment than dying for it ever could be." He gestured to his men, who lowered their weapons with obvious reluctance. "We're done here," he said. "But Silas, if you ever come down from that mountain again, if you ever give me cause to think you're a threat to anyone else, this conversation will have a different ending." "Understood," Silas said quietly. Vincent mounted his horse and rode past them without another word, his men following in sullen silence. Clara watched them disappear around a bend in the trail, then turned to find Silas staring at her with an expression of wonder and disbelief. "What you just did," he said, shaking his head. "I've seen men face down entire armies with less courage than you showed walking up to Vincent Kellerman." Clara felt her knees begin to shake with reaction now that the danger was past. "I couldn't let you face him alone," she said. "Not when I knew there might be another way." Silas dismounted and pulled her into his arms, holding her close while the mountain wind whispered through the trees around them. "You saved my life today," he said quietly, "not just from Vincent's guns, but from becoming the kind of man who would have killed him to protect you." Clara pulled back to look at him, seeing the truth in his eyes. He would have fought Vincent and his men, would have added more deaths to the tally he already carried, if she hadn't found a way to break the cycle of violence that had shaped too much of his life. "We saved each other," she said, touching the silver ring that caught the light like a promise made solid. "That's what partners do." They remounted and continued up the trail toward their mountain home, leaving behind the ghosts of old feuds and the weight of past violence. The ring on Clara's finger caught the sunlight as they rode, a symbol of their true union, not the desperate bargain struck in a crowded church, but the conscious choice of two people who had found in each other the strength to build something beautiful from the ashes of their separate tragedies. Behind them, the town of Cedar Falls continued its healing process, while ahead lay the cabin where their love had grown strong enough to move mountains and wise enough to choose mercy over revenge. The silver ring glinted like captured starlight, a tangible reminder that some bonds are forged, not in desperation, but in the conscious choice to face whatever comes together. 1 year later, Clara stood on the cabin porch, watching the sunrise paint Elkhorn Ridge in shades of rose and gold, her hands resting on the gentle swell of her belly where new life grew. The hand-carved cradle beside her rocked gently in the morning breeze, Silas's latest creation, fashioned from mountain pine and polished to silk smoothness during the long winter evenings when the snow had piled higher than the windows. The cradle represented everything their mountain sanctuary had become, a place where love could grow without interference, where two people could build a life based on choice rather than circumstance, and where the future stretched ahead bright with possibility. "Up early again," Silas said, emerging from the cabin with 2 cups of coffee, the familiar ritual that had begun their days for the past year. "The baby's active in the mornings," Clara replied, accepting her cup gratefully. "I think he or she likes the sunrise as much as we do." Silas settled beside her on the bench he'd built along the porch rail, his arms sliding around her shoulders in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Below them, the valley spread out in all its wild beauty, morning mist rising from the streams and bird songs echoing off the canyon walls. "Any regrets?" he asked, a question that had become a gentle joke between them. "Just one," Clara said, leaning into his warmth. "I regret that it took a corrupt banker and a wedding auction to bring us together. If I'd been braver, if I'd come to this mountain on my own, we might have found each other sooner." "Everything happened exactly as it needed to," Silas replied, his hand moving to rest protectively over hers on her belly. "We weren't ready for each other before. We needed to be broken a little, needed to learn what we were willing to fight for." Clara thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, the desperate gamble of their first wedding, the gradual building of trust and affection, the discovery of evidence that had brought justice to Cedar Falls, and finally the confrontation with Vincent Kellerman that had closed the circle of violence that had shaped so much of Silas's past. Harold Fitzgerald had been sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, his crimes fully exposed and his victims finally receiving justice. The town of Cedar Falls was slowly rebuilding under honest leadership, and the people who had lived in fear of the banker's corruption were learning to trust their neighbors again. Father O'Brien had written to tell them that Sarah Morrison had given birth to a healthy son, and that her husband was proving to be a kind and gentle man who honored her father's memory. Jacob Morrison's sacrifice had not been in vain. His evidence had not only brought down Fitzgerald, but had also ensured his daughter's future happiness. "Do you think we'll ever go back down to town?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. "For supplies, maybe. For the birth, if Dr. Patterson thinks it's necessary." Silas tightened his arm around her. "But this mountain is our home now. This is where our children will grow up, where we'll grow old together, where we'll build something that lasts." Clara smiled at the certainty in his voice. Over the past year, they had indeed built something that would last, not just the physical improvements to their homestead, but the deep partnership that had grown from their unlikely beginning. They were no longer the desperate strangers who had kissed at an altar out of mutual need. They were Clara and Silas Boone, husband and wife, partners in every sense that mattered. The cradle rocked gently beside them, waiting for the child who would be the first fruit of their love. Silas had carved it with the same care he brought to everything he built, every curve and joint fitted together with the precision of a man who understood that the most important things in life were worth doing right. "Have you thought about names?" Clara asked, a conversation they returned to, often as her time grew closer. "For a boy, maybe Thomas, after your father," Silas said. "For a girl," he paused, his voice growing softer, "maybe Mary, after my mother." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the generosity of his suggestions. He wanted to honor both their families, to give their child connections to the people who had shaped them before they found each other. "Thomas Boone," she said, testing the sound of it. "Mary Boone, both beautiful names for a child who'll be lucky enough to grow up here." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, painting the peaks in brilliant gold and chasing the shadows from the valleys. This was their time, their place, their peace earned through trials that had tested them individually and together. In the distance, an eagle circled on the morning thermals, its cry echoing off the mountainsides like a blessing. Clara watched it soar and thought about the freedom they had found in this wild place, the way love had given them both wings to rise above the circumstances that had brought them together. "I love you, Silas Boone," she said, the words carrying the weight of a year's worth of mornings like this one. "I love you too, Clara Boone," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible." The cradle rocked between them, waiting for the child who would learn from the very beginning what it meant to be truly loved, truly wanted, truly safe. Around them, the mountains stood eternal and protective, their sanctuary and their legacy rolled into one. Below in the valley, Cedar Falls continued its healing, while here on Elkhorn Ridge, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, prepared to welcome new life into a world they had made beautiful through the simple act of choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and building over destroying. The sunrise painted their faces in gold as they planned their future, the gardens they would plant, the rooms they would add to the cabin, the stories they would tell their children about the day a mountain man walked into a church and changed two lives forever with the words, "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years." Some love stories begin with grand gestures and passionate declarations. Others start with desperation and grow into something beautiful through patience, courage, and the daily choice to see the best in another person. Clara and Silas Boone had lived both versions, and as they watched the sun rise over their mountain kingdom, they knew they had found something worth more than gold, more lasting than reputation, and more powerful than all the forces that had tried to keep them apart. The cradle rocked gently in the morning breeze, ready to welcome the next chapter of their unlikely love story, a story that had begun with a kiss and a promise, grown strong through trials and trust, and would continue as long as the mountains stood tall and the sun rose each morning over Elkhorn Ridge. In the distance, the church bell of Cedar Falls rang the hour, its bronze voice carrying faintly on the mountain air a reminder of where their journey had begun and a blessing on where it would lead them next. Love, after all, was not just about the moment two people found each other, but about all the moments that came after, when they chose again and again to build something beautiful together. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of seasons to come, children to raise, and a lifetime of mornings like this one. Clara closed her eyes and listened to the symphony of their mountain home, the creak of the cradle, the distant call of eagles, the soft murmur of Silas's voice as he planned improvements to their homestead, and beneath it all, the steady rhythm of two hearts that had learned to beat in perfect harmony. This was what happiness looked like, she realized. Not the grand gestures or dramatic moments that filled the novels she'd once read, but the quiet contentment of two people who had chosen each other and continued choosing each other every day. It was coffee shared at sunrise, hands that found each other without conscious thought, and the absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The baby stirred in her womb, responding perhaps to the peace that filled its mother's heart. Clara smiled and placed both hands over the small life growing within her, imagining the day when she would place their child in the cradle Silas had crafted with such love and care. "Do you think our story will have a happy ending?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Silas turned to look at her, his grey eyes warm with the kind of love that had grown stronger through trial and testing. "Mrs. Boone," he said, lifting her hand to his lips and kissing the silver ring that caught the morning light like captured starlight, "I think our story is just beginning." The cradle rocked gently between them as the sun climbed higher over Elkhorn Ridge, blessing their mountain sanctuary with golden light and the promise of all the tomorrows they would share. In the distance, life continued its eternal cycle, seasons changing, flowers blooming, rivers running toward the sea butt here on their mountain. Time seemed to pause long enough for two people to appreciate the miracle of finding exactly what they hadn't known they were looking for. Some stories end with a kiss, others with a vow, but the best ones end with the understanding that every ending is really just a new beginning. Clara and Silas Boone had found their happy ending in each other, and as they sat together watching the sunrise paint their world in shades of gold and rose, they knew that the greatest adventures still lay ahead, written not in dramatic gestures, but in the quiet heroism of choosing love, day after day, for the rest of their lives.